All right. Hi, how are you guys doing? Today I'm going to talk to you about biomes that are aquatic. So these are biomes that can be found in the waterways. They are large areas of water that have very distinct characteristics and species that live in them. So first I thought we'd talk about a current case study. Okay, so did you know that there is a chemical found in sunscreens? It's very popular. It's pretty much in all the sunscreens that I found on my shelf. The chemical is called oxybenzone, and it has been shown to be quite harmful to coral reef larvae. In fact, when scientists were doing a study, they found that it did lead to coral bleaching. So states like Hawaii and places like in Key West, Florida, they've actually banned the use of these sunscreens because they don't want their coral obviously to get bleached. While we're going along in this lecture, just keep that in mind as like why it's really important to preserve these kinds of biomes and what impacts this has on communities that are in those biomes. All right, so how are biomes distributed in the water? Well, again, just like terrestrial biomes, aquatic biomes are distinguished by certain characteristics. So they're determined by salinity, which is a measure of salt concentration in the water. We also have turbidity can affect them. So turbidity, in case you don't know, is the measure of suspended particles in the water. Also, how many nutrients are in the water, and also temperatures, right? So there are different temperatures around the globe, and so that can determine what kind of biome, aquatic biome, will be found in the area. So looking at the water breakdown on this earth, you can tell that most of the water is salt water. 98% of the water on earth is salt. That leaves about approximately 2% fresh water. And of that 2% fresh water, most of it is locked up in ice or glaciers. The rest can be found underneath the ground in aquifers or in rivers and streams. So we're going to talk a little bit about all the biomes that you can find in salt and freshwater. Let's start off with the freshwater biomes because that is obviously important to us because we use it as a drinking source. And so it's very important that we take care of our freshwater biomes because we need water in order to survive. So the first aquatic biome that is freshwater we're going to talk about is a stream. A stream is a small, narrow river that usually leads to a larger lake or ocean. Here in Los Angeles, a stream that you may have visited is Ballona Creek. It runs out by the airport and into the Pacific Ocean. We do have various streams around the area, but again, they usually lead to a larger lake or, in our case, an ocean, the Pacific Ocean. Rivers are large natural streams that, again, will usually flow into a large lake or an ocean. They tend to carry much silt or sediment, and with that can come nutrients and sometimes, unfortunately, toxic chemicals. They can carve canyons like we've seen in the Grand Canyon, and rivers, they tend to pool at large areas right before they get to their, usually an ocean, and those areas are called deltas. So take a look at this graphic. These are some of the features you should probably know about a river. So wherever the river starts, we call that the source. Okay, that's the source of the fresh water. We can also call it the headwaters. That's like the start of the fresh water. The source will trickle down with gravity, and it will usually go into smaller creeks or streams, and we call those tributaries. The tributaries will lead to a larger river system, okay, and then it heads out to in this case, an ocean. The mouth of the river is usually like the end of the river, and the delta area is where we have that mixing of sediments, of freshwater and saltwater. All right, so right now I want you to think about what are some of the largest rivers in the world that you know of from, I don't know, history class, geography. These rivers carry about 50% of the world's freshwater runoff back out to the ocean. So just take a second, think about all the rivers that you may know and jot them down. Okay, so here is a picture of the major rivers of the world. You can see here that in the United States, we don't have very many major rivers. Obviously, you probably could have guessed the Mississippi and the Missouri that leads to the Mississippi. There's the Yukon in Alaska, Mackenzie in Canada. But then obviously you probably know about the Amazon and the Nile, then maybe the smaller ones that aren't really talked about, Danube, the Congo, the Yangtze, the Lena. All these rivers of the world deliver 50% of the runoff to our oceans and lakes. All right, what's a pond? So a pond is a small area that's usually filled with water. It's usually fresh water, and they can be natural or artificial. Here in Los Angeles, we have a lot of artificial ponds, unfortunately. They may arise naturally in like a floodplain of a river, so like a small little depression that's formed in the river, or they could just be isolated, small isolated depressions that are in the landscape. All right, so compare a pond to a lake. A lake is a very large aquatic biome that is usually created from some sort of geographic depression. So something came along and carved a huge hole out of the land, and of course, water took its place. Just a disclaimer, some lakes can be salt water and some lakes can be freshwater. So even though I put this in the freshwater biome category, some saltwater lakes do exist. The largest lake by surface area is Lake Superior, and it can be found in the Great Lake area. It's near Wisconsin, Michigan, Minnesota, and of course, Ontario, Canada. However, if you wanted to know what was the largest lake by volume, that is Lake Baikal, and that is found in Siberia, Russia. It actually is a lake that was formed by a continental rift. So two plates were pulling apart and water filled in, which contributes to its depth. The lakes are zoned depending upon, again, characteristics of light and nutrients. So the littoral zone is usually the shallowest zone right here, and it also tends to be the warmest and where like people play when they're, swimming in a lake. We have the limnetic zone, which is like the open lake zone. And of course, most of the sunlight is here on the top layer. And then as you go deeper, it gets colder. And then the deepest zone of a lake is called the profundal zone. There's also two different categories of lakes. You have oligotrophic lakes and eutrophic lakes. Oligotrophic lakes tend to be like what you think of with a pristine lake. You look at it, it's very clear, it has very little nutrients in it, tons of oxygen. And again, compare that with a eutrophic lake, which is down here. They tend to be like the greener lakes if you're looking at them. They're full of nutrients, sometimes unfortunately from runoff from people. That nutrient runoff can lead to excessive algae growth, which in the long run will lead to a decreased amount of oxygen. So if you're comparing biodiversity to oligotrophic and eutrophic lakes, oligotrophic lakes tend to have more species that live in them. All right, and the last thing that you have to know about lakes is thermal stratification. Okay, so as you go down in a lake, sometimes you hit this thermal layer that's called a thermocline. And it's usually a very thin layer, but that thin layer, you can see a massive drop off in temperature. How is this formed? It depends where the lake is. Sometimes it's seasonal, as you see in the diagram here. In the summer, you get an increased amount of sunlight hitting these lakes. So obviously the top layers get very warm, and that could create a very warm layer and then a thermocline, and then below that very cold temperatures. It could also be temporary. depending upon amounts of sunlight that you get in the biome. So it varies based on location. All right, let's talk about marine biomes. So our saltwater biomes. Okay, so let's talk about oceans. So oceans are obviously high in salinity, but the salinity isn't that high. It's only 3.5%. What does that mean? So that means for every liter of ocean water, there's about 35 grams of salt in that liter. The salt is mainly sodium chloride, but not always. As you probably know from elementary school, the Pacific Ocean is the largest ocean, and then we have the Atlantic Ocean, the Arctic Ocean, and Indian Ocean that round off the major oceans of the world. So in the oceans, there are obviously areas where communities and systems interact. The first one is an intertidal zone, and an intertidal zone is really where you have the ocean and the land mixing. And so because you have that mixing, especially with the tides, the organisms that live there have really had to adapt to those very harsh conditions. So for example, waves are being generated in this area. You have major temperature differences between the land and the water. Sometimes there are storms, sometimes there are sunlight differences. So all these organisms have learned to adapt to these conditions. You can also find mangrove forests in saltier areas. Mangrove forests are groups of trees and shrubs that live in tropical warm waters. They tend to have these root-like structures that kind of come out of the water, and they're found in coastal intertidal zones. What sucks about the mangrove forests is that they're being destroyed at very, very high rates. What are they being destroyed for? A variety of reasons. Rice farming, rubber tree plantations, palm oil plantations, shrimp aquaculture farms, and urbanization. So humans are moving into the areas, into the waterways. So here is a picture of mangrove forest lost, and hopefully we can reverse this problem. All right, just like the lakes, oceans also have zones. They are created from concentration differences in sunlight and nutrients. So the top layers tend to get the most sunlight and have the most nutrients. And of course, that's where you're going to find most of the life. As you go down into the ocean, into the abyssal areas, you get very low sunlight concentrations and very low nutrients. And because of that, you don't see a very abundance, or you just don't see a lot of life. So you see very strange creatures like the anglerfish that lives down in these abyssal zones, but they have, again, adapted to those very harsh conditions. All right, something that lives in our oceans and zones is algae, and I don't think people understand how important algae is. It's a primary producer, and in doing so, it photosynthesizes. So it provides a lot of oxygen to our atmosphere, and of course, it removes CO2 from the atmosphere as well. I read some stat that 75% of the oxygen we breathe in is actually coming from algae. It's not coming from the vegetation, the trees that we think are on the land. And our next aquatic biome is a coral reef. And coral reef, like I talked about in the last lecture, they are actually animals, but they're living with an algae that's called zooxanthellae. This interaction is actually very mutualistic. So they each get something in return. And zooxanthellae is what gives the coral these very beautiful colors. If you look at coral close up, they almost look like an upside down jellyfish. So they have these little tentacles that pull things out of the water for them to eat. And as you also probably know, they are home to many, many, many different species of fish and marine wildlife. Marshlands and wetlands, these are areas that are, again, depressions in the land, but they tend to exist along the coast. Water is usually present for a short period of time, except if it's a coastal wetland, then it's usually there more frequently. And then compare that to Estuaries. So estuaries are usually termed where places where fresh and salt water meet, and that usually happens at the mouths or the deltas of the rivers. The water here tends to be brackish, which means it has very low salinity, but it does have salt in it. And what's important to remember about wetlands and estuaries is they do act as environmental filters. So they kind of slow down the flow of water back out to the ocean, allows it to infiltrate back down into the ground. They do serve as breeding grounds for certain fish species like halibut. They're breeding grounds or resting areas for fish, and they do act as buffers for storms for anyone that built a house along the coast.